And so the New Testament is spread out all over the known world in a very short, brief period of time because Christians wanted people to possess the Scriptures. When somebody would say, hey, can I copy that? You bet. Let's do it. And so the manuscripts go far and wide and end up all over the place. This results in multiple lines. It's vitally important to realize transmission of the text in the New Testament did not follow a phone game single line. Not only are written documents less liable to corruption than what is whispered in the ear, but the phone game involves a single line of transmission, just one line going around the circle. The New Testament originated in multiple places, written by multiple authors, with books being sent to multiple locations. So the phone game idea doesn't work. It's not valid. You cannot apply it to how the New Testament texts are transmitted during those early years. This multifocality leads us to the final considerations that demonstrate the bankruptcy of the modern attacks on the New Testament. To make specific changes in a text. And what is the normal accusation? My Muslim friends say, look, Pauline Christianity changed the original writings and made Jesus into a god and introduced the cross and atonement and all the rest of this stuff. Or you've got all the New Age folks. I'm going to date myself here, but remember Shirley MacLaine when she did Out on a Limb, remember? And she's out next to on the beach going, I am God, I am God, I am God. And everybody's going, no, you're not, no, you're not, no, you're not. And stuff like that. Well, you know, they were channeling Ramtha and doing all the rest of this wild and crazy stuff. Well, they would say, well, you know, reincarnation was originally in the Bible, but they took it out, the Council of Constantinople. That sounds really good, and it works real well because most of us go, Council of what? You know, we don't know anything about the Council of Constantinople or Nicaea or Chalcedon or anything else like that. So we're not really sure about that. We don't talk about that kind of stuff at church very often, so don't really know what to say to that. Well, the fact of the matter is, the assertion they're making is that some centralized body, or let's use something much more up to date, Da Vinci Code. If you saw the Da Vinci Code, what's the idea? Well, Constantine comes along, and he writes his own Gospels, the 4 Gospels. He gets rid of 80-some-odd other Gospels, which, again, is just such utter foolishness that every historian in the theater is going, you know, just twitching when they come out going, how did that happen? Especially when you start seeing everybody else going, oh, that's fascinating. It's like, oh, Igor, help us. You know, it's just, it's terrible. But he makes fiction look bad. It was just really, Dan Brown just really went out off the limb there. But what's the idea? One centralized Constantine gathered up all the copies of the New Testament and changed them. Folks, we've got satellites and we can't find Osama bin Laden. How in the world is Constantine, in the early part of the 4th century, supposed to track down all these manuscripts? Some of them I've shown you are already buried in the sands of Egypt. It's ridiculous to think that there was ever a time when any centralized body, if there even was a centralized body, remember, up until 313, Christians are running and hiding. There's no centralized body that can do this kind of stuff. Nobody can get on a cell phone. You can't use satellite imagery. This was the ancient world. There was no means by which some centralized authority could come along and go, this reincarnation thing isn't working out. Let's get rid of it. Let's try resurrection. Let's try that one. Let's insert that. It couldn't have happened. It's ridiculous to think that kind of wholesale corruption could have taken place. We can prove beyond a shadow of a doubt. No such central agency ever existed. Christianity was a persecuted religion made up mainly of the lower classes. There was no central authority, could have ever gathered up all the texts and made wholesale changes. Such was impossible in the earliest days of transmission. And given that we have such ancient texts now, if someone had, let's say, in the 5th century, made a bunch of changes in their texts, and we find manuscripts from the 2nd century and the 3rd century, aren't the changed texts now going to stand out like a sore thumb? Well, of course they are. But that's not what has happened. As we found older and older texts, what do the older and older texts show us? That we've had the right thing all along. And so we can prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that this kind of wild-eyed accusation simply doesn't have any basis in history itself. And so that's exactly what I started preaching about right there. So, just the opposite has been the case. Now, So, all allegations of purposeful corruption, such as those made by Muslims, fall upon the mere consideration of the hysterical, that's me right now, the historical context and the data itself. The rapid, widespread distribution of the New Testament manuscripts in the first 2 centuries precludes any purposeful, centralized corruption. But, the fact that the Christians did not go, could I see your scribe card? Could I see that you've been professionally trained to be a scribe? Since the Christians didn't do that, then what we have to deal with are the errors that they made, scribal errors that we are able to examine and able to understand and able to come to conclusions about. Because they weren't perfect scribes. That fellow, remember P72? He's 1,800 years ago. He loves the Word of God. He makes a copy. He wasn't a perfect copyist. He skipped chi a couple times, the word and. He wasn't a perfect speller. Things like that. That's why we have to examine those early textual variants. But that's the price we pay for being able to say, our text has not been altered. It has not been changed by people who've decided, well, we're going to insert entire doctrines or take out entire doctrines. That simply could not take place. You'd have to have a centralized authority that always has control over the text to do that. And that's exactly what the Quran is all about. That's what the Muslims should be concerned about, is that there always was a centralized authority in control of the text of the Quran. From the beginning onward, there is a centralized authority. And so the Muslim has to ask himself the question, how do I know that Uthman did not make changes in what he had after the death of Muhammad? How do I know that? That's one of the issues we can get into. But this leads to another important point. When scribes copied their texts, they were very conservative, often incorporating marginal notes into the text since they could not be sure if the note was original or not. How many of you ever had to write a term paper on an IBM Selectric? Okay, a couple of you are going, all right, okay, I'll admit, all right. Those of you if you've ever done that with only a computer where the computer inserts your footnotes, you are a total wimp. Okay? You have not gone through life until you have to type a paper on an IBM Selectric because you're typing along, you're trying to be as careful as you can, and you're trying to remember, I need to put a footnote in, and then you forget, you get to the bottom of the page, you forgot your footnote. Guess what you got to do? Take it out, rip it up, start all over again. That's what it was. Some of you are going, man, he's old. Yeah, that's the way, this was back in the days of the scribes, okay? Well, think about if you're writing the New Testament manuscripts on leather. Like I said, you don't want to go kill Betsy to start all over again in the backyard. So, if you do skip something, what do? Well, what they would do is they would insert it in smaller writing in the margins, just like sometimes we try to do. And, my professor wouldn't accept that, or my teachers wouldn't accept that, but that's what they would do. Now, let's say you're reading that manuscript 50 years later. The person who copied it's dead. You can't go back, what did you mean here? And so you're looking at it, and you look at this thing in the margin. Is that a note explaining the text? Or is that supposed to be in the text? And the tendency of the scribe was, put it in the text. Be conservative, don't lose anything. Okay? So they were very conservative, often incorporating marginal notes into the text since they could not be sure if the note was original or not. So there is a gradual expansion over time in regards to the conservative viewpoints. That means they even preserved mistakes or silly readings. This may sound bad at first. I mean, you've probably all heard about the one manuscript where it's very clear we had a scribe who didn't get his caffeine that morning. And he was copying, remember Sinaiticus had four rows? And so some scribe was not doing well that morning. And so we can tell because the manuscript he was doing, instead of going down the rows, he went across. And this was in the genealogy of Jesus. And so God is now like the son of Pharis, and stuff like that. And it makes no sense. But we still have the manuscript, amazingly enough. And you might go, well, that doesn't sound really good. But think about it for just a moment. It may sound bad at first, but consider what it really means. This means the New Testament text this is a word you need to know, tenacious. Tenacious. Tenacity is an attribute of the New Testament manuscript tradition. What does that mean? It means that readings are preserved in the text. All readings. including the original readings, are still a part of the manuscript tradition. Even when in those few places, most variants, there's only 2 readings. It's either this or it's this. There are a couple where there are literally 4 or 5 different readings. And they can be very difficult to examine, very difficult to decide. But the wonderful thing about the tenacity of the New Testament text is one of those readings is the original reading. That's what gives me the emphasis, the oomph to keep doing the work, to keep examining it, is that when people say, oh, well, the original readings have just disappeared. No, they haven't. That's not the nature of the New Testament manuscript tradition. Now, according to the clock on the back, have about just enough time to race through one quick key theological example, just to whet your appetite or scare you to death, one of the two. 1 Timothy 3:16. 1 Timothy 3:16. Look at it in your own Bible so you can see this. Compare the King James Version and the New American Standard. Here is the King James. And without controversy, great is the mystery of godliness. God was manifest in the flesh, justified in the Spirit, seen of angels, preached unto the Gentiles, believed on in the world, received up into glory. But the New American Standard says, by common confession, great is the mystery of godliness. He who was revealed in the flesh. Now, the difference between God and he who seems to be like a lot. And again, if I was a King James only advocate, and this is one of the primary texts King James only advocates use, man, I could really start preaching on this one. Look at how the modern translations try to remove the deity of Christ. They're all a bunch of Christ-denying liberals, and so on and so forth. And I could rip and snort and spit and everything else. The variant is theologically relevant, is it not? I mean, is this one of the places where Jesus is described by the term theos or not? Is he described as God or not? But is there some kind of evil agenda in operation here? Were there black-robed evil people sneaking in and changing ancient manuscripts just so that they could try to get rid of the deity of Christ? That's what a lot of people would like you to believe. And in English, God and he who don't look a whole lot alike, do they? But the variant, actually, is very evenly matched amongst the Greek manuscripts. And let's take a look at what it actually looks like. Simple, right? Okay. The first one is the reading God, and the second one is the reading he who. Let me use color again to show you what the difference between the two is. There's the whole difference. Let me blow it up for you and make it real simple. In the ancient unsealed script, they abbreviated certain words which are called the nomina sacra, the sacred names. God, Jesus, Lord, etc., Spirit. And what they would do is they abbreviate the word, and then he put a line above the word to show it was an abbreviation. So theos, which has 4 letters, would be abbreviated as theta sigma. The word for he who, the relative pronoun, is hos, omicron sigma. And so the whole difference between these two readings is 2 lines. And remember something, what are you writing on? You're writing on papyri and you're writing on vellum. Take a look at the front of your leather Bible. What do you find on the front of your leather Bible in leather? Little tiny lines. So the difference between theos and he who would be 2 little lines.